Let's actually do some sequencing, or let's bring in per sequence, etc. So we've got enough stuff here that we can sequence. So creating a sequence is simply a case of clicking on the new sequence button and choosing the type of sequence that you want to create. Now you can choose musical or animation. We'll do musical here because it shows us a few additional things, but an animation is useful if you just want a sequence without music. And by default it'll be 30 seconds, but you can go into the sequence settings and change it to be any length of time that you want it to be. If you choose a musical sequence, you need to choose some audio. This is some royalty-free audio, so YouTube doesn't complain. So I apologize for the quality of it. And then you get to choose your frames per second. Now, these are the two most common frame rates, and you will again hear all sorts of people claim that one's better than another. 40 frames per second is obviously double the amount of data, double the amount of frames. It doubles all of your file sizes. Generally, it definitely doubles the amount of rendering work that needs to be done, and therefore it can be more intense. The upside of that, what do you get as a payback for that additional time? Well, your fades will tend to be a little bit smoother, and when you do your lyrics, you'll be able to get those mouth movements to be that much closer to the audio. That's the benefit of going 40 frames a second. The reality is outside of yourself, no one else will notice, and 20 frames per second is good enough. So, yeah, unless you are absolutely obsessed, you can get away with 20 frames a second. You don't need to do 40 frames a second. So you can choose that. Now, at this point, we can just do a quick start and done, and it will create the sequence. It will bring the audio track in here at the top. It'll put in a timing track which has got nothing in it, and it will show all of my models. Now people often ask me, well, how do I order my models, and how do I make sure that they always come in the same order? And so there's a couple of things that you can do here. So to edit and actually there's one other thing that people do. People will come over here and they'll throw a new prop in, and they'll come back to their sequencer and the new prop won't be there. And they're kind of like, well, how do I get that prop in? Well, the way you do that is by right-clicking and doing Edit Display Elements. And this brings up control over the models. If you look at this list here, whoops, where'd it go? If you hold the control key down, the window doesn't dock. So this is the list of models. It's in the same order that's here. If I grab this star and drag it down to the bottom of the, if I drag the star and drag it down to the bottom, he says you can't actually drag it to the bottom. You have to drag it one off the bottom. You'll notice that it reordered it here. So this allows me to control the ordering of my models. Here's my spinner. It's over here in the display elements that aren't available. I have to drag it down here if I want to make it available. And now it's available here for me to sequence. Now, the order that you want to put things in here, look, commonly I would just do a sort. And, you know, I would generally sort by name with groups at the top by size. This is generally, I think, the easiest order to work with, but there are a bunch of other sort sequences. Also, once you're happy with it here, you can come up here and say, you know, this is my master view that I want to use for all sequences, and click OK. And now I've created this new my master view where I can bring everything across, and I can go and do that sort, get them all in the right order. It's all good. Okay, so now this is my master view. This is my perpetual master view. And the reason you want to do that, and notice how I need to save here because that changes the layout. If I now go back and create a new sequence, so let's discard the changes here and let's go back and create my musical sequence again. Whoops, didn't want to go there. Oh, I went and screwed that up. I want to show you something, and then so we choose our audio, and when I choose 20 frames a second, if I come in here, I can choose my master view as the master view that comes up by default, and that will bring everything in the order that I prefer them to be in, which is a much better view, and so it sets the master view according to that. So that will save you time having to reset them up each time you create a sequence. Now, the first thing you might want to do when sequencing is create a bunch of timing timing tracks, and you can do that a couple of different ways. You can come up here, we've selected this new timing, so I can come up here to the audio and click and press the T key to mark potentially some key sections of the song, which, you know, is, and this is just a audio sequence, there's no actual lyrics etc to it, but I can just mark a couple of key sections. And if I want to, I can even come in here and, you know, if I hold the shift key down and double click on it, I can put in a label and I can say, you know, this is the loud section, or I actually don't know this audio at all, and I can actually label things.
Why would you label or why would you mark timings?
Why would you label? You might want to label the timing so that, you know, we want to mark the chorus and the, you know, this is the lead-in intro, etc. Because when you're zoomed in and you're in here trying to look at things, sometimes it can be really useful to know where in the song I'm at. So it can be useful to do things like that. The other thing that you can do up here is you can add more timing tracks. And because we installed the Queen Mary Vamp plugins,
while we're waiting, sometimes if I delete all the timing tracks, I don't see a good way to add them right back there, like how you got the new timing.
Yeah, that's right, because you can't right-click and access it. And the way you would do it in that circumstance is you'd come up to File, Sequence Settings, and go to Timings here, and you would create it here. We'll ignore that for the moment. We'll just go with timing tracks as is. We can also add timing tracks which are fixed in duration. We can also add another empty timing track here. And what you can do is you can actually play the audio back, and if you press the T key, you can actually create those timing marks. So if you've got a good ear for it, now I know you can probably not hear the audio, and that's entirely deliberate. And so you can go and create a timing track manually here, and even once you've created the timing track, you can come in here and edit it and line things up more correctly with the audio. Now notice how, you know, there's not infinite granularity here, and that's down to that 50 milliseconds timing that we selected. So you can't move it to any arbitrary point, and you know, this is because at the end of the day the sequence is going to have a certain frame rate, and so anything that we showed there would not be real, and so it doesn't make a lot of sense. Now when that happens, where you've got a situation like this where it's either too late or too early, always set the timing mark early. And the reason you want to set the timing mark early is because the light travels faster than the audio does, and it will always look better to the eye if you go a little bit early rather than going a little bit late. So yeah. Now what you can do is you can start to drop effects down, and the way in which you want to drop effects down is that you need to drag them from the toolbar up here, and you can make this bigger. There's an option to make it bigger, and there's a whole bunch of different effects up here. I'm not going to go through all of them, where there's 50 of them. We don't have enough time to do that, but suffice it to say that it's really as simple as grabbing an effect and dragging it down and dropping it onto a particular model. This happens to be the whole house group. Remember, we set that center to be the middle of my tree. There's all of these properties that you can set to control how this effect looks. This is what makes xLights incredibly flexible, but also incredibly time consuming. So if I set it to 3 colors and I set it, you'll notice how down here it's centered on the tree, which is where we wanted it to be centered, and the effect is going over the whole house. Equally, I can, and you to move effects between it, you actually have to use the keyboard, but I can bring this down and put this just onto my tree. I think it was tree 5 is my tree, my main tree. And so yeah, I can bring it down to that and just put it onto a single element. You can actually sequence both things at a time. Now there is a natural order to things, so I've now put a butterfly across everything, but you'll notice that the big tree is still doing the spinner, and that's because models that are lower down on the list take priority over models that are higher up on the list, and that's why you would generally put your groups at the very top of the list and your models further down, so that any effects that you drop onto the models will override the group that they're in. If I reverse the order and put the group below the models, then everything would have the butterfly on it. The panels themselves, the controls that you have here, the effects settings tab or panel here controls the settings that are specific to the particular effect. So when I'm focused on a pinwheel, I get a bunch of properties that control how that pinwheel looks. Whereas when I click on the butterfly, I get a set of properties that control the way the butterfly looks. So very, very different. The color, the layer blending and the layer settings tab are common across all effects, but what they do will vary by effect. So the color panel generally controls the colors that are in effect. So you can have, you can choose different colors. If you left click on the colors, you can actually change the colors here. There's also a whole bunch of palettes here that I can choose different predefined palettes that I may want to choose. I can also reverse the palette and do things like that. If you want to have gradients, you can get gradients by right-clicking on these things and you get access to the gradient editor. And so here I can choose either some predefined gradients or I can go up here and customize a set of gradients. Once you've used a gradient's interesting because you can change how it gets applied. So in this case, this gradient is being applied over time, and that's what that little clock underneath means. And so, that particular part of the spinner is changing color over the duration of the effect. But you can click on the clock and change it. So now it's radially changing color. So it starts at one color, and then as it moves out across the effect, it changes color. You can also choose a whole now it's changing color around the effect as it moves out. And if I change this speed to 0 and change, I think it's the offset, so we can spin it around. Okay, you can see how that color is being applied radially versus by time and so forth. So you've got a lot of control over your color here. There's chroma key and hue adjustments and all sorts of things. You can also add sparkles in here, which will sparkle over the duration of the effect as well for that extra fairy dust. The layer blending tab, this controls a couple of things. So when you put an effect onto a prop, you can actually add multiple layers. So you can insert layers below, and you can have as many layers here as you like. And then you can control how the effects blend together. So I can do some fire here, and if I rotate this just right so that the blackness is at the bottom, you can see that there's actually a fire effect here. If I make the thickness right, so now you can see that there's a fire at the bottom that's coming through underneath the pinwheel, which is on top. And so if I give it some speed, the fire stays there at the bottom, and the pinwheel stays on top. And so this panel up here allows you to control how things come together. So you can do things like you can have the pinwheel actually act as a mask over the top of the fire, and so it either masks it or unmasks it, things like that. You can also average the two together so the colors blend together and so forth. And there's this layers and buffers video that I made back in September in 2019, which goes through all of these and explains them all and shows you how they come together. And so once you start to get sequencing, you're going to want to play with that. This is also where your fade ins and fade outs are available. So if I want the fire to fade in over 3 seconds, right, I can do that. Now you've got this green bar over the top, and the reason is because the fire is fading in. It starts off black and then it appears over the duration of the effect. And then I can also do an out transition over a second at the end, and so it will fade out at the end. So all of those sorts of things are controllable here as well. And then finally you have the render buff or the layer settings tab over here, and this lets you do some interesting things like, you can say, well, that pinwheel, I only want the pinwheel to be applied in the bottom right hand corner. Or I can move that around and put it in just the middle section of that particular prop. So you have control over how much of the prop the effect is actually rendering on. This also lets you choose dramatically different render buffer styles, which are all available up here. Much more noticeable when you get into the whole house here, where there's a huge number of render buffer styles. And again, I'll refer you to that buffers and layers video that will control to understand how all of these things work. But needless to say, this can have a massive impact on how the effect renders and how things come together. And so getting yourself familiar with this is kind of necessary if you're going to want to go that way. Now, the next one is obviously, and the way in which most people are going to do their sequencing is actually doing imports. And so I'll probably finish up with some imports. And so the first thing you're going to want to do is go and grab a sequence from the share drive. And so if you go into the free sequences, you can go and choose, a sequence. Actually, xLights around the world is always a useful place to go. So we can go and grab Logan's Can't Stop the Feeling, which was a few years ago. We want to download that.
Can you show us where the link to that Google Drive was at again?
You get it via the xlights.org page. You go to resources.
It's posted in the chat. I asked for that.
And you go to resources and you go down to the Google Drive link there.
Okay, thank you.
So it's downloaded. So the next thing I'm going to want to do is so I'm going to copy that. I'm going to go back to my show folder. And the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new folder here called Imported. Because putting your imported show folders into your show folder is really important if you don't want things to break. So there it is there. This is his folder. There's his sequence. This is an old sequence, so it's not an XSQ file. It actually does have the audio in it. It's got a bunch of images and everything else for singing faces and so forth. Now, there's a couple of things that we're going to need to do to get this to work correctly, and I'm going to go through some of them, but not all of them. So the first thing that we need to do is go back to our controller tab here and click on, let's save that, we'll ignore that. So the first thing we're going to want to do is go back to our controller tab and do a change temporarily, and we're going to want to switch to that show folder that we just downloaded, which is this one here. And what that will do is switch to Logan's show folder. Now this has come up in yellow, which tells me that this is a temporary show folder that I'm in. If I go and look at the layout, this will be Logan's layout. Actually, it's not even Logan's layout, it's some other generic layout for some reason. I know Logan's layout and it's not that. And so now what I'm going to do is I'm going to open up that sequence. And we can do a quick render of the sequence, what the sequence looks like. Now I didn't share my audio, so hopefully when I play I won't. Song.
We did hear the audio before, Keith.
You did? Oh, it's okay. I can mute it when I edit. It's fine. For those of you using Zoom, if you share in Zoom, you want to set your audio to very quiet so that people can't hear it. Well, not so they can't hear it, so it doesn't blast their ears off. Come on. All right. Okay, so at this point in time, you can play the sequence to check that everything's come in. We can't see the house preview, but here's the house preview. Right, so it's got a singing face up here on a matrix, and it's got a whole bunch of stuff going on. Now, I'm not going to do all of that stuff. But that looks good. So that's all come in okay. Now the next thing I'm going to do is save it, and this is really important. You must save the sequence at this point, because what that does is it locks all the image paths and the video paths and the shader paths and all of those things into place. Many people don't do that and then wonder why things don't come in correctly. Whether you save the layout or not at this point is kind of irrelevant, but I will. And now we click Restore to Permanent and come back to our show. So now we're back in our layout, which is kind of boring. And what we're going to do is we're going to go and create a new sequence. It's going to be a musical sequence. We're going to go in and choose the audio file that came with that song. And there it is. And now we're going to do an import effects. And now we need to go back to his show folder and choose his sequence file. Now notice it's an XSCQ file now. That's because we saved it, and so it upgraded it. Now we get our mapping dialog, and the mapping dialog is where I get to choose all of the elements which are in this person's show and try to map them to the handful of elements that are in my show. Now this is not necessarily a one-shot process. You may want to go backwards and forwards several times. You may want to go back and create new groups, etc., to import things onto. We're not going to do all of that, but we'll do some of that. So the first thing you want to do is go and have a quick look through this list and decide which things are going to map well to it. And look, not everything will. He has a mega tree, didn't he? Some people like to open up a second copy of xLights at this point so that they can look at it. So here's a whole house group. Well, we have a whole house group. We can map that stuff. That's pretty straightforward. He seems to have some spiral trees, some matrices, some flat trees. I don't know. Let's go and put the roof on one of our polylines. I'm going to put his matrix. I put his matrix on my tree just for the hell of it. My mega tree is 5 from memory. I don't know, mini tree flat. Let's put that one there. Put that one there. We don't have any snowflakes. He doesn't have any arches. I don't know, I'm going to put my spiral tree on the arches. I don't know. At this point, I'm just guessing. All right, we've thrown a few things down. You definitely want to bring in all of these effects, and you also want to bring in this imported blend mode. We really need to default that to on. At this point, you would typically save your mapping so that you can come back and reuse it. In this case, I don't really care. So I'm just going to map it. And what it's done is it's brought in all the lyric tracks, it's brought in all the effects. Now the lyrics are not going to work because I haven't set up any singing faces, but if I went in and set singing faces up on my tree, I could make these things work. But I haven't done that so far. I think he's using... Where's my mega tree? Tree 5. Yeah, I don't think he's not. I haven't brought the singing faces in. I'd have to bring the singing faces in for that to look good. So now you need to render, because in having imported the effects, you need to render them so that they're actually visible in the show. And now when I click on play here, you'll see that the effects have all come in. Now, is this the optimal way to bring this sequence in? I doubt it. But it's not too bad. Now, if you don't like the way it's come in, maybe you've decided that you mapped it incorrectly, you can go back and redo the import. You can override the effects that came in on a particular model. You can map things. You can map the same thing to multiple models. You have lots of options in how you do the import. I'm not here to tell you the best way to do it. At the end of the day, every sequence, every supplier is going to be slightly different. Most of the vendors who will sell you sequences, they will have their own videos that will talk through some of the processes that they're using and will give you ideas as to the best way to bring their sequences in. They'll often recommend that you create groups that are very similar to theirs, and that will definitely help you bring in the sequences. The vendors tend to write their sequences so that they are easy to import, whereas the sequences you find on the Google Drive are going to be much more variable. People are basically sharing the work that they did, and they're not necessarily worried about how easy or hard it is for you to bring it in onto your layout, whereas the vendors care a lot about that sort of stuff and will invest a lot more time in it. Now, maybe you don't want to bring in your xLight sequence. Maybe you want to bring in an LMS file from your Law S4 days, or maybe it's a Law Edit file or a Vixen 3 file. And so the process is similar largely. Let me go and find an LMS file here to bring in. All right, this is a LMS file for a 12 strand ribbon tree. No, I don't want to do that. Let's go on, just pick this one. All right. So let's go and create a new sequence here. I'm just going to create a 30-second animation. For those that want to know how to change the duration, if you don't want 30 seconds, it's just come into sequence settings and change this 30 seconds here to be, I don't know, 90 seconds for a minute and a half. It's easy to do as that. To import a law sequence, again, you come in, you need to go and find, in this case, your LMS file that you want to import. So here's an LMS file here. And this is that LMS file, which I can now bring in. Now, this is a lot more difficult to bring in. In this case, these are obviously arches in 8 segments, but I'm importing them effectively at the node level. And so here's my arch here. That's my 8-strand, my arch with 8 nodes on it. And so the easiest way to do this is if you come here and click on node 1, and you come up here and click on the first one here and just press enter 8 times, and it will map those 8 nodes into those 8 segments of that AC arch. So that's the kind of thing that you do to map those things in. Trees are a little different. Again, because I don't really know this person's layout, it's very hard for me to map them across easily. But I could do things like, again, I don't know what these things are, but if I click on the strand here, I can bring these things in at the strand level. I don't know. Who knows how that's going to look. But this is how you would map Lightorama in. Now there is some stuff up here for mapping CCR strands. I'm not going to go into that. Mapping Lightorama in is one of those things that requires a fair bit of time to go through.
What do you do if you have a mega tree as an example and you have 16 strings and they have 24 strings? Like how does that work?
So the easiest thing to do is to map it to maybe the middle strings on your tree, or if they've got more than you have, then you need to choose a subset. There's no easy way, except if it's Superstar. With Superstar, you can tell the Superstar import to either stretch the Superstar import out or compress it in, but you will obviously lose data. Yeah, there's no getting away from that. You will lose data.
So there's no way to like compress 24 into 16 or something.
No, you can choose to leave out. I mean, effectively, that's what xLights would do at any rate. You just have to choose which strands you want to leave out. Now, when you do an import from Lightorama, it brings the data in at a much lower level. So that import has just finished, and you notice there's no effects. And the reason there's no effects is because it's actually brought the data in at the node level mostly. So if I go to my arches, and this is my AC arches, and I double click down, you can see that here are the effects that came in from those arches, and they're at the node level. And you can access this at any time by double clicking and zooming in. Which tree was it that I can't remember which tree I brought it in on. Maybe I didn't. Oh, there it is, tree 2. And so here's those effects that I imported in at the strand level. Again, you will need to render all in order to watch the sequence back. And when you watch the sequence back, okay, so there's the tree. Lighting up or not lighting up accordingly. So there's lots of fading going on here in this section, and here there'll be a lot more sort of spinning and etc. going on that's been brought in. So that's how you bring Lightorama in. I have not covered everything that I'd hoped to cover. I've covered maybe lots of things that I hadn't hoped to cover. I haven't covered playing your show. There you want to be looking at Falcon Pi Player or xSchedule as probably your main options. There are a bunch of videos on that. I often do a video or a session in September just before everyone's shows gets going to walk people through. For those that want to use xSchedule, I was a little surprised in the survey the other day of the number of people that are using xSchedule. You know, there's a lot of noise and we see a lot of people that are using FPP, but there's obviously a bunch of people that still do use it. And we encourage you to do so if that's what suits your particular scenario. We also haven't talked about all the tools up here, like things like Fpp Connect. And once you start to get into the whole FPP land, you're going to want to learn about Fpp Connect and how it dramatically simplifies your life in terms of uploading configurations to your Pi Player to make playing your show a lot easier. A lot of issues that we see people have when it comes to show time is just getting misalignment between X-Lights, FPP, and their controllers. And so Fpp Connect and the controller upload are going to be your friend in trying to minimize those issues. But yeah, there's a huge amount to xLight. I could spend, and I have spent, 2 full days teaching 8 hours a day and still not covered all of the depth and capability in xLights. I encourage you to look at the videos. Be wary, as I said, that things that have age will no doubt have changed somewhat, but not everything changes. The piano effect hasn't changed in the 4 years since I last rewrote it. So you watch a video from 4 years ago on the piano effect and it's largely going to be fine. The on effect has not changed dramatically since xLights was released. So, a lot of videos are still current, so there's not like there's zero value in the older videos, but just be conscious that they may not be up to date. So any questions that anything that people felt that I really, really should have covered and I didn't cover that they'd really like me to cover, I'm happy to spend some time going through those things before I wrap up.
Can you go over just a quick setup in the xScheduler? I used it a little bit. Well, I used it this year running my show, and I just had some issues every time I would launch it to go back in, like the next day or whatever. Some of my sequences were missing, and I had to recreate them. If you don't mind, could you just do a quick setup of that?
Look, I could spend a couple of minutes and show you how to set up xSchedule, but like I said, it really deserves its own session. So I've launched it here. Obviously, it's asking for my show folder, which I can set. What happened? Oh, there it is. Still right. Oh, there it is. Okay. So here it's come up. Creating a playlist is really as simple as just clicking the add button here. You don't have to give it a name, but you can. You add in your FSCQ file. I've only got the one that we've been working on. And so that's my playlist. I could add many songs under that if I wanted to. And then scheduling it is simple as clicking the schedule button and saying when exactly you want your show to start and stop, what days of the week, what dates you want it to run, and so forth. and you click OK, and it's telling me that on the 7th of January at 7 p.m. this sequence will kick off. It will play this particular song, which runs for 2 minutes and 19 seconds on loop, and it will finish it at 10 o'clock, I think was the time that it finishes it at. And that's really all it takes to set a schedule up and a sequence. Now, don't forget to click the save icon, because if you don't click the save icon, nothing's been saved. So you do need to click that save icon or go to File and choose Save there to write your schedule to disk, so that the next time you run xSchedule, it will obviously kick off. If you don't click the save icon and you close xSchedule or you turn your PC off, etc., that won't be there the next time. Look, there's a whole bunch of other capabilities and features in xSchedule, but I'd suggest people watch that video or watch those videos if you want to understand what it can do and what FPP can do for you. You don't need to dedicate your PC to run your show. If you want to use a Pi and you're happy to configure that and get it up and running, the Pi can be a great option for running your show, and it brings a number of capabilities that are unique to the Pi as well that you don't get with something like using your PC to run your show, and a few downsides as well. But they're largely, again, it's one of those things, right? No solution is perfect in all scenarios.
What video was that again now?
Oh, there's many of them. Again, check out my YouTube channel. Subscribe while you're there. Did I mention that? I might have mentioned that.
Yeah, I watched one of your videos, and it's of an older version of the xLights, so it's a little bit different. So okay, I'll go back.
Well, but if you go to my YouTube channel, right, there's over 100 videos here, right? So there's a lot of them. And if you go back, so this one here was all about optimizing xSchedule playback. So if you've got issues with xSchedule pausing, etc., this is the video for you. 42 minutes of all the possible reasons why you might get lag and how to fix it. There's a number of update videos here on features of xSchedule. The last big xSchedule video I did is actually a while ago. Oh,
yeah, that's what I was saying, some of the layouts.
Yeah, advanced xSchedule, this one here. Look, it's 2 years ago. But look, to be honest, xSchedule has not changed materially in its basic functionality in a long time. So if you want to go and understand xSchedule at a reasonable level of detail, you probably want to go back here. The fundamentals of xSchedule really haven't changed since it was released.
Why would you choose xSchedule or FPP?
So
over the other.
So look, whole bunch of different reasons. Look, the benefits of FPP. It's a single board computer. It's by the time you buy all the odds and sods to get it set up, it's going to cost you somewhere in the realms of $50 to $70 with power supplies and SD cards and the computer itself, and that's going to vary obviously by country. But it's a pretty cheap option. It's a very powerful little thing. You can then stick that anywhere in any box. If it got stolen, it wouldn't be the end of the world. And you don't have to tie up your computer. Not everyone has a computer just laying around that they can dedicate to their show for a month or two, depending on whether you're starting in Halloween. So FPP is really useful from that perspective. It's also potential. Obviously, FPP is able to act as a controller as well. So some people will merge together the show player functionality with their show. If you're running a virtual matrix or running P panels, you're going to need something like a Pi or a BeagleBone to run those sorts of things. And so even if you choose not to use it as your show player, you're often going to have these things in your show. And so that's why they are really, really popular. There's also some capabilities that the Pi has with its GPIO ports, etc., that makes it possible and fairly easy to integrate interactivity, etc., into your show. So again, another strong reason why people would go with the Falcon Pi player. The downsides of the Pi player, not material, but it's a bit more fiddly to set up when you sit in the Zoom room and you listen to the support cases. There's lots of challenges with getting it set up. It can be quite fiddly. Once you master it, it's not hard. It's not rocket science or anything, but you just there's extra steps that you need to go through and you need to get right. So that can be a bit difficult. There was a time in the past when it was a bit less stable and people would find that, it would lose its configuration or stop working. That's largely in the past. And, if you see a video that talks about that, you can largely ignore that. You do see it from time to time, but it's exceptionally rare and not really a reason to not use the Pi player. There's also a bit more fiddling that you need to do to push the configuration. It's obviously one more device that you need to configure, whereas xSchedule is much more tightly integrated with xLights and therefore will generally pick the sequences up as you render them. And configuration changes tend to flow more easily through into xSchedule. There are issues with xSchedule on the OS X platform. Dan has decided to stop supporting xSchedule, and consequently it makes it hard to access it. I have been keen to still make a version available for users on the Mac platform that do want to use it. Dan is very, very anti that, and that's something that I'd still like to work out with him, but he does not want a version of xSchedule to be separately published for the Mac platform, and I don't know what to do about that. I definitely have builds of xSchedule that work on the latest OS X or latest versions, but he does not want those made available. And at the moment, I'm respecting his desires, although I just don't know what to do.
This year, I prepared the show using Vixen, and then I exported it in the Fpp file, and then I configured everything in Fpp. So now I'm going to work with X-Lite this year. So from the Fpp configuration point of view, is there anything I need to be aware of, or it should be pretty much same? Because
it's much simpler in xLights, and the reason it's much simpler in xLights is because you have tools Fpp Connect. So this is not going to find any because I haven't turned my Pis on. So normally when you run this tool here, it would give you a list of all your Pis up here and a bunch of things properties that you can set. And your sequences are all down here. And what you do is you basically say to xLights, this Pi is my show player. I want it to send out data. I want to send these sequences. And you click the upload button and it will configure your Pi for you to match your xLights configuration. It will upload all of your sequences to your Pis and be ready to play. You don't have to configure the Pi.
Yeah, this is really easy. And if I want to have what do you call the remote master and remote, will that work in a similar way?
Yeah, absolutely. So again, you would say that prop or that particular Pi would appear up here, and you would say that you choose the format, which would be typically v2 sparse, and you'd say UDP out, you'd say no. It would show up here that it's a matrix or whatever it is, and it would push the appropriate data to that Pi for you, including stripping out any unnecessary data. You will find that there is a chalk and cheese experience when it comes to things like FPP and controller configuration between xLights and Vixen. Vixen is much more a configure Vixen and then go and configure your controllers and make everything match, whereas xLights over the last couple of years has moved to a situation where we try to encourage people to configure everything in xLights and then push your configuration to your controller, and that eliminates a whole bunch of issues that people have with mismatching configurations. Often when you come in here and you say to people, look, I can't get this to work, or this is not quite coming right, all they'll do is walk you through the process of pushing the configuration back to all your controllers to ensure that everything matches.
I have another question which is not related to xSchedule. It is more like layout. So for example, I have created my layout, but when I installed the props, I decided to change the position of one of my props, and then I come back and change my layout. And other than changing my layout, the position of that prop, is there anything else I have to do? Do I need to update anything?
So let's imagine, for instance, that I took these arches and I decided, no, I'm not going to put them there. I'm going to put them over here, right? right? So, and that's what I want to do. Now, obviously, that's going to have some impacts, right? Because my whole house group is now out of whack. So my center point's out of whack, so I'm going to have to move that back. You know, so we're going to have to go and fix that up. Turns out we're probably going to have to... Oh, that went too far. Right, so set my setter point correctly. And then what I'm going to want to do is I'm going to want to come up to here and I'm going to want to choose Tools Batch Render. Now what Batch Render allows you to do is to choose your sequences and you click OK, and what it will do is it will open each sequence up that you select in turn, render the sequence and save the sequence to generate that FSCQ file. You would then go up to Tools Fpp Connect, and now if you weren't moving it around on the controller, if you had also said, well, as a result of me doing that, actually I need to come in and take those arches wherever they are. Where's my arches? And I need to move them down onto port 12, so you could do that. So at this point, what you would do is you would upload the inputs and outputs to reconfigure your controller. Then you'd go to Tools, Fpp Connect to push up the FSCQ files, etc. to your FPP, and then you're good to go. That's all you have to do. I say all, it's a bunch of steps and you need to do them in the right order. But yeah, that's what you need to do. And that will render all your sequences, upload all your sequences to your Pi and set your Pi up ready to play the show. It is one of the things in the hobby. Unfortunately, things are never as easy as you'd like them to be. They're easier than they used to be, but you know, this is not a hobby for someone who just wants to plug a few things in, click a few buttons and have everything work. This is a do-it-yourself hobby that over time has got easier and easier and more approachable, with a richer pool of vendors who offer products which make things easier than they used to be. But it doesn't make things simple. This is a hobby that is going to require an investment of time for people to learn and understand how to get things working. And it's one of those things that you don't want to be leaving this to the last minute and thinking, I will just be able to throw it all together and it will work. Bill's given us an FP. This is Fpp Connect when you've actually got things populated. So you can see here, it's found multiple Pis. It's got the type of FSCQ that the Pi is going to receive. It controls whether or not you send media to it. This is not sending any UDP, so that means that the Pi is not sending any data out, but you can have the Pi send out data, and you know, you can have a virtual matrix, and this one's one of the Culp controllers, and so forth. So these are the sorts of properties that you would get if you actually had a Pi connected to the network.
Where could I go to research controllers for my situation?
There's a couple of videos. The VCS conference had some videos which talked about different types of controllers. I would strongly suggest that you actually join this room on a time when we're not doing a presentation, which at the moment there's people in here every evening. So pop in an evening and say, look, I'd like to spend some time, have a picture of your house, have some ideas about what it is that you want to do. What I would do is I would actually throw the props onto your house that you think you're going to have, right? And then come into the Zoom room and say, I'd like to have a conversation with someone around what might be the best controller for this layout that I'm thinking of putting together. And people will talk to you about, you know, whereabouts is your power? What sorts of pixels are you going to run? That sort of thing will influence it. You know, if you've got a very distributed layout, then, you know, something with remotes is going to be probably the right answer. If you've got a bunch of AC lights that you're bringing over from, you know, your old Christmas show, then obviously that's going to require certain things. You know, you'll need to look at, you know, ease of use. How important is ease of use versus cost, right? If you want the most bang for the buck, then, you know, that's going to steer you in one direction versus another. If, you know, you want something that is supremely easy to use and well supported, that's going to steer you in different ways as well, right? So all of those factors are going to be things. The important thing is when you talk to someone, if they only mention one type of controller and they won't talk you through the pros and cons, then you're talking to the wrong person. You want to find someone who is able to actually talk you through the pros and cons of different controllers in your circumstance. And so, you know what, you want to test them as to why a Falcon, why a Culp, why a Hanson controller, why a Lightorama controller, and why that would be better in this circumstance versus that circumstance.
I
Right.
guess that's my concern, is finding a person who will be.
Right, but you can tell. So, if you come into the Zoom room in the next few weeks before this place gets quiet, right? At the moment, it's still pretty busy every day, but it will get quieter as the year goes on, and then it will pick up again towards the back half of the year. But if you go in and you ask the question in the main room and listen to the responses that you're getting, if you're getting that sort of that balanced view, right, then you're probably getting good advice. If you're getting advice that's very one-sided and it's just, well, this is why I chose controller XYZ and this is why, therefore it must be the right one for you, you're probably getting the advice that's somewhat biased. Right? The person should be asking you questions. If the person just gives you an answer, then clearly they're not interested in your circumstance. They're just interested in pushing something. Yeah, that's true. John D said, or come in and ask a few people at different times. Get a couple of different opinions.
Mm-hmm.
Right, we all have biases, right? We all have controllers that we prefer to work with, and understanding that. And we've got biases both for and against certain controllers as well.
Just wondering, what would be the best way to put in a column matrix that's 7 pixels across and 57 high, but running off 2 strings?
Sorry, it's 7 pixels wide, so it's not an even number.
Yeah, correct.
Life's a bitch. So there's no simple way to do it. What are you doing at the end of the first string? So first of all, is there a good reason why you're doing it as 2 strings? Because there may or may not be.
It's about 399 pixels, so I just prefer to break it into 2 ports.
Okay. So there's no way using the matrix model to support that. So that's a problem. The way in which I would model that, okay, so given that and forced to do it that way, so vertical, what I'll do is I'll say it's 1 string, 7 strands per string. How many pixels in total did you say?
399.
399. All right. Okay, so that's first of all how I would model it. Now, there is a concept of a thing called a shadow model, and I would use shadow models to put behind it to represent the actual configuration for upload to your controller. This is the way at the moment that you can still achieve all the configuration benefits but have these funky models that aren't well supported. And the way you would do that is you would create, and you don't even need to use anything fancy. So you can create a single line here. So your first string is how many pixels? Of that 399? Sorry,
228.
228. So what I do is I'd create a string of 228, and then I'd create another string of, what's the residual? 111? No, 171.
171. Yep.
171. All right, so what I do is I'd create these 2 here, right? And so that's matrix. So I'm going to call this one matrix shadow 1. And I'm going to call this one matrix shadow 2. All right, so what we do is we create 2 things, and what we want to do is we want to map these 2 elements to these same start channels. And the easiest way to do that is to take this matrix here and change it to be set on the start of the shadow matrix 1. All right, now that's broken a few things. So we need to set this model start channel to be the end of single line 5. All right. All right. So now we've got these 2 here. Start channel 14186, and this one here is at the end of that one. So these things effectively fully overlap their channels with this prop here, and that's deliberate. And so that's because we want this to be a shadow model for the matrix. So we're going to set that shadow model property there. Shadow model for the matrix. Now, when it comes time to upload it to the controller, here's what we're going to do. We're going to go to the controller tab. We're going to click on visualize. And instead of mapping the matrix, right? Because if we map the matrix onto port 9, it's just going to use 399 pixels, and we don't want that. So instead what we're going to do is we're going to take the shadow 1 and the shadow 2, and we're going to map those two things independently. But these things are going to occupy exactly the same channels. So this one here starts on 12397, and if you look at the matrix here, it also starts on 12397. So we're never going to actually put this matrix on anything. We're just going to do the shadows here and upload it. And that will configure your controller correctly. And these things, these two models here, we can actually bulk edit these and move them to an entirely new preview. Let's call it unassigned. And they will disappear off here. If you want to get to them, you can get to them up here. But we don't need those things anymore because we're not going to sequence them. We're going to sequence the matrix. We're just using those two models to do the upload to the controller. And so it's not a trivial thing to do, but this is how you can support upload and models that are weird. I made a whole video on on shadow models and how to use them to configure controllers about 6 months ago.
Okay, fantastic. And if you do a tools check sequence where you get overlapping issues...
That's a good question. What do you think? Will we or won't we?
I should do.
You should do. Okay, and we'll wait for check sequence. Check sequence takes a while. So here's check sequence. Oh. All right, let's scroll down. Model spanning controllers. Controller ports, no nodes. What's overlapping channels? Oh, I don't see. Oh, here we are, overlapping channels, none found.
Okay.
Why, he says, why? Well, the reason why is because I set a property when I created those models. So if you remember when I created these models, I said I am deliberately making this a shadow model for the matrix. And so when check sequence runs, it finds this as an overlapping channel, but it knows that those overlaps are actually intentional, and so it doesn't issue the warning.
Okay, that's fantastic.
Oh, there is another option, yes. So someone else has highlighted there is another option, and that's using a custom model. So you could, in theory, take this model here and turn it into a custom model. And so if you do an export as custom model, right, it's called matrix, and we import it in, brings in the matrix model, right? So there's the same model. It looks exactly the same, but it's now a custom model. And because it's a custom model, you can actually set the number of strings here, and you can say, you can check the individual start nodes, and you can say, what was the second one? The first one was 100.
228.
228. So you can say that this one is going to be 229 is the second string. And then if I go back to my controller tab and do the visualize, and we grab matrix 2, here it is here, and drag it down, you'll see that it's done the same thing.
Oh, fantastic.
Now, the downside of that is that that custom models are a little bit less efficient for xLights to process. So there's a bit of an overhead associated with this that doesn't exist with the shadow models. There are also some scenarios where shadow models is the only good answer. But this is definitely a plausible way to solve it.
Okay, I might give the shadow one a go and see how that goes, so thank you.
Well, you can go either way. Either way, like I say, it will work and both will upload correctly to the controller. Okay. The downside of the shadow models is you end up with those extra models that are floating around. They will largely deal with themselves in terms of start channels, so you don't have to worry so much about that. But yeah, the beauty of this one is that it's just a single model and it's fully self-contained.
Yeah, well, that solves that.
So Alex has asked a question, why no groups within groups? Why nested groups? Well, the answer is there's no rule that says you can't do groups within groups. You absolutely can do groups within groups. The downside of doing groups within groups are a couple of fold that generally leads to people not going that way. One is that it's not tested as often by us, and so if there are going to be issues, they're going to come up there. Now, that's not really a big deal. I say that like it's a big downside. The reality is I'm not aware of any current bugs that are outstanding that relate to groups within groups, but I know in the past issues have surfaced, and often that's where we don't spot them. The other problem with groups within groups is that it changes the way in which some of the render buffers work. When you're sequencing on a group, you have a bunch of different render buffers here, and so some of these render buffers behave very differently. Now, the default doesn't. The default works perfectly. Everything will work exactly as you expect. But particularly some of the per models, etc., will behave very differently if you use groups within groups and you sequence at the top level. You'll find that things don't necessarily render the way that you thought they would render, and creating a group containing all the models directly will actually deliver you a better outcome. So there's no absolute rule that says that you can't do it, but just doing it is not necessarily a good thing either. Is there any risk of using groups to create aliases for models, or in some cases to change the render model to make importing easier? Okay, so you can create a group that contains just a single model. There is no issue with doing so. Knock yourself out. It will give you access to the additional render styles that the group offers that are not available on models by default. There are some issues that do result, and a classic example of this is if you take a 360-degree tree, maybe one with a bit of resolution, 36 strands or something, and you drop an effect on it using the default layout, it will look extremely different and not necessarily in a good way when you use a group. But again, this is just one of those situations where it's horses for courses. You choose the appropriate model to sequence on at the appropriate time. It's got nothing to do with it being a bad thing or a good thing. It's doable. You just need to choose which one's going to work for you in a particular scenario. I know lots of people that do put single models into a group because they like some options that it gives them.
Just want to check, what's the best way, I'm still really, really new, for two people to work on a sequence, like so both my husband and I both want to do some sequencing, but someone mentioned that there's issues later if you do it on your own PC and then try and put it all into the one show folder. It's better to use a shared location. Is that right? Or...
So it's like anything where you've got files that you're potentially maintaining in two different locations. You obviously need to be very careful that you don't make a change that will then break someone else's change. The files, the layout files, which is contained in the RGBFX file and the networks file, you would generally only want to maintain on one computer and make that the master. It's very easy to work on different sequences on different computers in parallel. That's not a problem. You can definitely do that. Working on the same sequence across two computers is a problem. xLights doesn't provide a way for you to merge changes together. Now, but what you can do is you can import. So if he's working on a sequence on one computer and you're working on a sequence on another computer, and maybe he's sequencing the megatree while you sequence the house outlines, and now you want to bring the two things together, then take advantage of the import functionality and import the effects from his sequence onto yours. But effectively,
we tend not to agree on those things. So I think we'll be doing our own sequences. But,
that's easy then, right? It's excellent. So just be wary. Just be wary of any changes to the layout or the controller tab, right? That's where you will run into issues. Now the problem with that is that, and this is not necessarily well understood, but there are some things that if you're working with on the sequencer tab actually cause the layout file to change. And so things like presets, changes to the previews, things like that when you make those changes here in the sequencer tab, it actually triggers the need to save this file, and that's where you're going to run into issues.
For this scenario, how well does it work if you use something like Dropbox and the two computers are working off the same show directory that way?
Well, it works. It's just you run into the issue of conflicting change. Depending on how disciplined you want to be, you may want to use something like a source code management system, like a GitHub repository or something, and keep stuff in that. That's actually my preference. I manage my show folder via a Git repository, and I just replicate it onto my show playing computer when it comes time to play my show, and then I work on another computer all the rest of the time. Look, it works most of the time. It's pretty good, but once you get into conflicts, that's where life gets really hard, because there's no easy way to merge together concurrent changes to the same file. It's really hard. But there's lots of people I know that do use Dropboxes. It's typically people that want to use two computers and don't necessarily expect that things will be changed at the same time on different computers at the same time. So they move from computer to computer and they just want to know that it's always going to be in sync. But when you've got two people, you do run into that risk that both people will change the same file, and then you'll have a clash. And things like Dropbox and the like don't really have ways to resolve that well. All right, Kevin's asked a question about brightness and the like. So brightness is a cumulative type thing. So if you set the brightness in xLights to be 50% and then you set xschedule brightness to be 50%, it's 50% of that 50%. And if you set the controller to be 50%, it'll be 50% of that 50%, which will be 25%. So everything just goes down, down, down. What about gamma? So gamma, the thing to understand about gamma is that gamma is just a formula that converts the brightnesses of the colors into a different brightness. So just like brightness, it gets applied at whatever point that you apply it, and it's cumulative. So if you set a gamma of 2.2 in xLights, it will apply 2.2, and that data will get applied and sent to the controller. If the controller then wants to apply a gamma of 2.2, it will modify the data again before it sends it out to the pixels. How do you change that in xLights? Well, it's simple. There's a dimming curve. So let's say I want the gamma of my tree to be 2.2. This dimming curve property here allows me to set the gamma. So I can come up here and say I want a gamma of 2.2. This is the color response curve that's created. You can also set RGB gamma, where you have a different gamma curve for each color if you so want to. There's a lot of control in xLights, but understand that this gamma is applied at render time, so it's actually written into the FSCQ file. All right, so there is no way to undo it, and if you want to change it here, you have to go back and re-render every sequence in order to update every file. That's why a lot of people apply gamma on the controller, because it can be applied and changed at playtime without having to go back and re-render every sequence.
I have a question. Is it possible to change the brightness in the middle of a song? Like say there's a strong downbeat and you want it to flash brighter. Can you change it in the middle of the sequence?
So you can obviously change the brightness on individual effects. Every effect has a control for the brightness up here on the color panel, but you have to apply it on each and every effect. There's not a global brightness setting that you can just set and say, at this point, amplify every color and reduce every color. There's no way to do that. However, I say that like that's true. There is something that you could do in theory, and that is, hypothetically, you could put the all group at the bottom here, and you could then apply a blend on it and have a master brightness control using a whole house group. So look, let's see if I can make this work. So what I'm going to do here, I'm going to go, let me go to my whole house group, because not everything's in my whole house group. So let's add everything in. Let's clone that group, and let's rename that group. Let's call it the brightness group. I'm going to save that. Let's go back to our sequencer. Now, because I want this to be applied at the end, I need to put this at the bottom of my group. So I need to put it right at the bottom. And let's delete these effects. All right, and so on my whole house up here, I'm going to throw a butterfly effect down. All right, so we'll put a butterfly effect across the whole house. And let's imagine that at the 10-second mark, I want the brightness to change. Well, one of the things that I could, in theory, do is I could come down here and do an on effect. Actually, I don't even need to use an on effect. Let me decide. All right, so what I want to do is I want it to flash and fade at that mark there. So what I might do is I might come in here. I'm going to set this. I'm going to set this to I don't know. Let's make it really obvious, 30%. Right, and then I'm going to copy that. I'm going to paste that there. I'll stretch it out. And then what I want to do is I want to put an on effect on here, and I want the start to be 100, and I want it to drop back down to 30. So that's the brightness curve that I would like to have for my sequence. So there is no reason why I couldn't do this. So a couple of things that I need to do. So first of all, I need to go to my sequence settings, and I need to make sure that allow blending between models is turned on, because it will only work if I do that. And the second thing that I want to do is I want to make this as a I think I want to make an average is what I want to do. And this last one I want to make average as well. So this is where we're taking into right. So now if I play this, it's dim, 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 goes bright, and then it fades back down to that dim level, and then it holds the dim level for the rest of the song. Right, and it doesn't matter where I put my effects. So if I put a bars effect on tree 5 here, and I do it again, right, so there's my why's my bars not showing up? Where's my bar on? Stop. Where's my bar? Oh, there's my bar. Okay. So now when I click on it, it comes in and the bars brightens up as well. So this acts like a master brightness track for the sequence. So it's doable. I've probably got it wrong because I've done average. The average is probably not what I want. I actually think it's I don't know, it may be minimum. I actually may want minimum. Is that going to give me what I want? Oh, it's still average. Yeah, that's what I wanted. I should have chosen minimum. So now it's dim. Oops. It's dim, goes bright, and then it fades back down again. There's no reason why you can't create multiple groups containing the same things and then use them in different render orders, right? But remember, the reason I had to put this at the bottom is I wanted this to override or take control of everything that had happened before. So that's why it had to be at the bottom.
Right, so if you want multiple brightnesses throughout the song or the track, you just
keep breaking it up. Just keep breaking this thing up into more sections and whatever. Right. Rachel, I've seen effects on the Megatree where the bottom seems fixed and the top moves backwards and forwards with a pattern to the beat. So look, I won't necessarily reproduce that exactly, but there's a couple of things to understand. So first of all, when it comes to the bottom, any effect can be isolated to the bottom purely by either right clicking here and saying I want the bottom half and limiting the effect down to the bottom half of the model. Sorry, we have all sorts of stuff going on here right now which is causing problems. So now we have an effect that's limited to the bottom half, and that could be anything, whether it's static or not. And then you can choose another effect using, again, a layer. So we can put a layer above or below. It's not really that significant. And you can put in something like a spirals. We can right click and we can say we want this one in the top half. And then typically you would use the spiral wraps here as a way to control its movement backwards and forwards. And we didn't touch on this, but there is such a thing as a value curve here that will allow you to move things backwards and forwards. Now, I'm sure their effect was much more elaborate than this is, but that's the sort of thing that you can do. And you can be much more specific about this. You can put some timing marks in so that when I go into this value curve, I can actually see the timing marks here. And so if we reduce the cycles on this sawtooth to be roughly the right number and go to custom, I can actually come in and cause the direction to reverse actually on those beats or those timing marks. Delete that one. We'll put that one down there and we'll move that one up there. And so now you've got something that reverses on those timing marks just by defining that curve. Do you have a kryptonite?
Are you invincible then, or not immune to something?
Oh, the things I don't know? Oh, yeah. Gil made a video on building a snowman model using the DMX effects where, he had the servo and he had a moving arm and everything else. Don't ask me to go and create that without watching Gil's video. I couldn't do it. It would take me a stack of time. It's really cool what it does, but it's not something I know. There are areas, like I said, right at the beginning of xLights that I either never touch or rarely touch, and therefore don't understand it very well. Even with the law imports, etc. I wrote the S5 import, but there's lots of things that I'm really vague on when it comes to lighter armor and how it works and what's the best way to bring it in. The only reason I know it so well is because I spend so much time in it, and I've poked around in the code and looked at defects and situations that people had and added a whole bunch of stuff to try and make things work well. But I'll hit things that Scott's added or Dan's added or Gil's added, and if I don't have a reason to get close to it, if I don't have a bug I need to look at, and you'll notice in my release videos, if I skip over things or just give it fairly short shrift, that's probably because I'm not spending a great deal of time on it and don't necessarily fully understand it. I often find that's the case with Fpp Connect. Most of what I know about Fpp Connect is through sitting in this Zoom room and watching people struggle with issues and working through how to fix things and knowing what should look like on the other end until and playing with it until it does. Any good way of creating a model for a 3D twig tree? So the most common way people would do that is using, well, actually it's interesting. A lot of people will just use just a tree model. And they'll do something really interesting with it. So first of all, they'll generally do it flat because they don't get a great deal of value out of it being in 3D. And then what they'll do is they'll set the bottom to top ratio. I think it's to is it? No, you can't, maybe not. No, maybe you can't do it with a minus. I thought you could. That was scary. I figured that might crash. Maybe you have to do it with a round. You set it to -6. And then make it 180. And they'll actually just sequence it something like this. They don't really fuss about exactly where each branch is. Of course, if you want to do something that's much more specific, you'd probably want to go with a polyline, because the polyline will really give you the ability to draw the lines along that twig tree exactly where you want it to be. And then worst case, you could go to a whole custom 3D model, but that would be a significant effort. And I'm not sure it would necessarily add a lot of value. Most people find that just a simple matrix or inverted tree would do enough. I've also seen people use spinners as well, I think. Is there a way to set a middle point on props in 3D? No, there's not. There is no 3D middle point. The problem with that is it's not incredibly obvious to me exactly how that would work, because it wouldn't be a middle point per prop, it would be a middle point per prop per camera view at best. So there's a few things that would need to be worked through, and you'd have to work out the best way to represent it. I'm not sure I've got a good answer for that one. How do you set brightness per element? Okay, well that's the same way as dimming curves. So there's two ways to set brightness per element. You can either set it at the controller level, and you do that by coming down to the controller connection and setting the brightness down here. You click the checkbox and you set the brightness to be, 20% or whatever. But understand that this only works if you upload the configuration to the controller. If you don't upload the configuration to the controller, this does absolutely nothing. The other thing you can do is you can go to the dimming curves and you can set a brightness here where you set it to -80, which would be 20% brightness. So it reduces the brightness by 80%. Now the downside of this, as with the dimming curve, is that this has the impact of only applying at the render time. So every time you want to change that brightness, you have to go back and re-render every sequence, which is potentially a large amount of work. And so you may or may not want to do that. The other issue with using the controller connection is that if you've got multiple props chained together and one of them you want at 20% but the others you want at a different brightness, that is possible, but only where your controller supports virtual strings. If you're using a controller that doesn't support virtual strings, something like, a Sand Devices or an Fpp or something like that, this won't work. Whereas if you're using a Falcon or one of the FPP based controllers, they do support virtual strings, and xLights will be smart enough to know that it needs to create a separate virtual string for that model because it has a different brightness setting. How often or what scenario would you press render? Okay, so render, generally speaking, you should never need to press render. The only situations that render is absolutely required is after an import. Generally, when you drop an effect down or you change a setting on an effect, it automatically detects that the effect has changed and it will kick off a re-rendering of that particular effect. Now, that being said, that's not a trivial process, and there are situations where it either due to bugs or other reasons it gets confused and it doesn't render correctly, at which time either clicking on the effect will trigger rendering or hitting the render all button will render everything again from scratch. The other time is if you've got suspend render turned on, then clicking render all will obviously kick off a render that otherwise wouldn't have kicked off. But generally speaking, you shouldn't find yourself clicking render all very often. Just click on the effect and it will immediately start to re-render that effect and anything else that needs to be rendered alongside it. Is it possible to import or export models into and from other lighting programs? And the answer to that is yes, but not that many. So when you do an import up here, we're in 3D, joy of joys. By default, it's the X model format, but it will bring in raw prop files, and there's also a file format called GDTF, I think it is, which is actually a DMX prop format file that's available where you can download specifications for your DMX elements and you can try and bring those in, and we do our best to map them to some various xLights concepts. The law prop files, last I tested these was with S4. I don't know if there's a new file format in S5. If someone wanted me to add that, someone would need to send me a file format. In terms of saving file formats from, or bringing in file formats from things like Vixen and the like, no one's ever sent me a file, so I have no idea what they are and what could be brought in. I do know that behind the scenes, both Law and Vixen do bring in the X model files. But that's really because we had them first, and all the suppliers, the vendors made them available in X model file formats, and the other vendors pretty much, or the other sequencers pretty much had to support them because otherwise they couldn't bring them in easily. So let's talk about the migration from Vixen and S5 into xLight. So there is experimental imports that we added, 12 months or more ago. They are limited imports in that they don't necessarily bring everything in. And the reason they're limited is not because technically we can't do it or we are unwilling to enhance the import. The challenge is I don't have a copy of S5. While I could download a copy of Vixen 3, I have enormous challenges with using it just because I know one sequencer and I know it really well, and I don't have lots and lots of time to spend time deciphering Vixen 3 or S5 for that matter. And so if we're to enhance the imports, I really need someone or some people to step up and provide us with samples that we can use to identify exactly, or to reverse engineer what they've stored in their files, which we would then map appropriately into xLights. So the mappings that you will find that exist today generally map effects across and give you an effect that is what we think is the best xLights effect to map to that effect. That may or may not be true. Sometimes it won't come across at all, and that's typically because I don't know anything about the effect, or we haven't identified something that it makes sense to bring it across as. We will typically bring colors across. I think we've got colors working on both Vixen and S5, but the settings on the effects are much more marginal. There is definitely some that are available in Lightorama. Some settings will come across and hopefully will be reasonably close. But with Vixen, I pretty much don't bring any effects settings across at all. So we'll just import the effects, put them in the right place, put them at the right time. But yeah, it'll be up to you to go back and tweak the settings on the effect to get it correct. Again, if someone wants to work with me on the various settings and helping me identify how to map them to xLight settings, I'm happy to invest time in doing so. But I need help and assistance, and typically that help and assistance turns into providing us with a very simple layout with a very simple single effect with an example of what it looks like in Vixen and an example of what we want it to look like in xLights, and then I will go through and I will work through the various conversions that need to happen. It's very hard to do it without that sort of information. It's not a simple process. It takes a fair bit of time, so it requires someone who's really willing to invest it. And for most people, of course, you're just doing the import once, and people don't want to necessarily invest a huge amount of time in that. But it is a great way to give back to the community of people that in future will want to tread the same path that you're now treading.